Welcome back to another Before You Read lecture. This is the Before You Read lecture for Esther and Daniel. This lecture will provide a brief overview of both Daniel and Esther, but will also do so in the context of what scholars refer to as court tales. So there'll be an orientation to that. And a brief word about why would I combine Esther and Daniel, two books that on the surface seem very different from one another, in a single lecture, and why at this point in the course, at this point in reading the Bible together, would we go about these books. And then finally, I'll conclude with some reading strategies. I want to start with the question of why combine Esther and Daniel. After all, they have some significant differences. Esther is as the name suggests, about a female protagonist. Daniel, about a male. It is not even clear if they are taking place in the same geographical location or if the narrative time is the same in the two stories. In Esther, the identity, the religious identity of Esther is almost hidden for the majority of the narrative. In Daniel, that religious identity is front and center almost from the very first chapter. So why combine them if they are so different? Well, in many ways, both Esther and Daniel, along with some apocryphal writings, help to answer the question of how Jews or Judeans living outside of Judah can live among non-Jews. How can they live among Gentiles? Both Esther and Daniel, in other words, are a response, a religious and social and political response to exile. So we have just finished in our earlier lecture the end of the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah, leading to the Babylonian exile. And so both Esther and Daniel are interested in lifestyle away from home. The technical term for this is diaspora. Both are diaspora texts. What does life look like in a foreign land? How can a Jew be faithful if they're not in their homeland, if they're not surrounded by other Jews, if they don't have access to their sacred temple? What does life look like in the land of foreigners? And so that's why Esther and Daniel offer a good combination, because they sort of give us a perspective of what life might have been like on the ground during exile. Of course, probably remembered and written several years or hundreds of years after the actual exile, but still working with the dynamics of exile and diaspora existence. As I mentioned earlier, scholars typically classify both Esther and Daniel as court tales. What do I mean by court tales? No, this is not Judge Judy. This is not divorce court. When I say court, I mean court in the court of a king, a royal court, a political court. And so these are tales, these are stories about Jews who have made it into the court of a foreign king. Now, Joseph, the story of Joseph in Genesis, is the predecessor story, really. I mean, this is the beginning of the court tales. Remember that Joseph experiences at first an unfortunate circumstance. His jealous brothers sell him into slavery in Egypt. And while he's in Egypt, he's actually falsely accused and winds up in prison. But while in prison, it becomes clear that he has this gift for interpreting dreams. And eventually, through his ability, he rises to tremendous power and prominence in Egypt. He comes to play a tremendous role in the court of a foreign king, in the court of Pharaoh, and eventually rescues members of his family. That is to say, he saves Israelites from that position of power. So there are some details, right? There is the experience of misfortune. There is the rise to power and prominence. And then there is the ultimate saving role of that hero. And so Esther and Daniel, as I mentioned earlier, are both court tales. They describe Jews in the court of foreign kings, Jews who, despite an initial misfortune, rise to a place of power and prominence in the court of a foreign king. Unlike the story of Joseph, however, these are more explicitly concerned with the challenges of maintaining Jewish identity in a foreign land. They are, as I just said, diaspora documents. They are exile documents. In these court tales, especially in Esther and Daniel, we begin to see what we would call stereotypical or even like flat characters. So the first is obviously the king or the person in power. More often than not, the king is not portrayed in a particularly positive light. Now, they may not be wicked kings in the ways that Second Kings narrates the story, but they're not positive in regard. Oftentimes they're fickle or they're gullible. They're rash and wrathful. They often paint themselves into a corner that they can't seem to get out of. At other times, they seem to be limited by their own laws or their own officials. In addition to the king, there are also the king's officials. And here is often in these court tales where we begin to see the real villains or the antagonists. Frequently, it is the officials, the lower ranking officials, who are the antagonists towards the Jews. It is their plotting, their planning, their scheming that threatens the Jewish people. It is also the officials who sort of gets the king off the hook, right? So the king can remain a ambivalent character, while the villain is really the other officials. And then finally, there is the portrait of the Jew and the hero in the story. In most cases, they are depicted as exceptional in one way or another. Esther is exceptionally beautiful, and the king is exceptionally drawn to her. Daniel is exceptionally wise and exceptional in his understanding. And beyond that, these protagonists are navigating their Jewish identity and their Jewish religious practice. So as we read Esther and Daniel, keep in mind the sort of stereotypical roles and the ways in which the narrative is playing with them. I want to provide a brief orientation to the book of Esther. It's a shorter book in the Hebrew Bible, and it tells the story of a Jewish woman named Esther and her cousin Mordecai and their exploits in the courts of a Persian king. Now, Esther names that king Ahasuerus in the narrative, but it is more likely a reference to Xerxes I, the Persian king. Esther, we learn, is an orphan who is protected by her cousin Mordecai. Eventually, Esther finds herself in the royal harem of the king, the house for the king's secondary and tertiary and so forth wives. She proves herself to be very attracted to the king and eventually becomes his queen. Esther, with the advice of Mordecai, eventually stymies the plan of Haman, one of the king's advisors. Haman intends to eliminate all of the Jews because he has been slighted by Mordecai. Esther risks her life to intercede for her people, and she is successful. The Jews are spared. Those who were sent to kill the Jews originally are slaughtered. And the Jews celebrate this with a festival known as Purim. In terms of the historical significance or historical likelihood of the story of Esther, Old Testament scholar John Collins calls Esther a, quote, festal legend that is associated with the Feast of Purim. He notes that there are a number of historical problems that emerge from a close reading of Esther, including the chronology related to Mordecai and the number of Persian provinces. In addition, the story is full of stock characters and hyperbole. In places, it presses the limits of reality. It seems that the story clearly aims to teach certain things about identity and about religion. Collins suggests that Esther was written sometime in the 4th century BCE in Eastern diaspora. That would make it one of the latest writings in the Hebrew Bible. And this is significant because it is written from diaspora and for diaspora, from exile and for an exile people. It deals with exile realities and what is it like to live in the land of the Gentiles. This is the earliest narrative that we know of that depicts Gentiles trying to wipe out entirely the Jewish people. And there are clues in the narrative as to why that might be. The first is that they didn't assimilate fully. They remained distinct even in a foreign land. They refused to worship other gods, to participate in the local and national religious life. And they held to particular customs around food that inhibited their social relations with others. So their foreignness was perceived as a threat, a communal threat, and perhaps a threat to the well-being of the country. There was some debate about the inclusion of Esther within the canon, mostly due to the fact that there are very few references to Esther in later Jewish and Christian writings, but it did eventually make its way into the canon. Finally, a couple of things to be on the lookout for as you read Esther. The first is pay attention to Esther as an agent, as a responsible agent. Where do you see her agency or her power, and where do you see the lack thereof? The second is pay attention to the noted absence or apparent absence of God in the story. What role does God play in the story explicitly, and what role might God be playing if it's not mentioned explicitly in the story? Next, let's say a few words about the book of Daniel. This is, more likely than not, the very latest composition in the Hebrew Bible, written in the 2nd or 3rd or 4th centuries BCE. There is even a good amount of suggestions that it's a composite text, that parts of it were written at different parts of history. There are some significant literary and linguistic issues with Daniel. If you ever try to read Daniel in the primary languages, you will encounter this difficulty. The first 2 chapters or so are, and then chapters 8 through 12 are written in Hebrew, and the majority of chapters 2 through 7 are written in Aramaic. There's no real reason that I know of for why it switches from Hebrew to Aramaic and then back to Hebrew. There are significant additions in the Greek translation of the book as well. There are 2 basic halves to the book of Daniel as well. Chapters 1 through 6, which will be the focus of our class, which is the story of Daniel and his associates. It is a court tale. And then chapters 7 through 12, which are a very different sort of story. The court tales really frame and build up to the narrative in chapters 7 through 12, which is really more of an apocalypse. It's more of apocalyptic literature. It relates more than with the book of Revelation than with Esther. And so that's why we're going to focus on the first 6 chapters for this lecture. There are, like with Esther, some historical issues that make us wonder about its historical reliability. There are dating issues around the siege of Jerusalem and the death of Jehoiakim. There's a mention of Belshazzar, who is the son of King Nabonidus, and Daniel names Belshazzar a king, but he was never really a king. There's also a mention of Darius the Mede, and we don't know of Darius the Mede from any non-biblical sources. All of this suggests that Daniel perhaps is something like a legendary figure or a notable figure that has been picked back up and reinterpreted as well. Once again, what are some narrative notables for the book of Daniel? One thing that you might notice is the degree to which foreign kings praise the God of Israel, praise Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This seems pretty significant. The second thing to note is risk and rescue. The Jewish identity is at challenge. There's a risk to that, and there's foreign pressure, and eventually the protagonists in the story take risks and they are redeemed. They are given safe passage. And then finally, you'll notice that the author of Daniel is very interested in the sovereignty of God, very interested in the determined path of God. So you may want to attend to that. Finally, a few reading strategies for Esther in Daniel 1 through 6. The first is pay attention to how the kings are portrayed in each. Where does power come from? How is that power limited? And how does the Jewish hero or heroine exercise power? The second thing to be aware of is what does it mean to be Jewish in each text? What is distinctive about identity or identity markers? How might the stories of Esther and Daniel help Jews navigate their existence in a foreign land? Finally, there is a significant difference in how the two texts portray God and God's work in the story. So pay attention to that. And the final sort of broad strategy is try to read these two texts in tandem with one another. Compare and contrast. Where do you see areas of similarity and where do you see areas of difference? And how do these offer similar but different perspectives on what life might look like in exile? Well, I'm excited to talk through Esther and Daniel with you and some of the questions and observations that you have in your reading. I cannot wait for our discussion and wish you all the best in your reading. Get to it.